right, so thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to see all of you here. It's great that we're reaching out into the outside as well. You heard my title for today, Fatherland and Mother Tongue. I want to introduce you to what's happening in terms of German Jewish identity in Germany today, and perhaps also think with you a little bit about where that is going in the future. My work is rooted in language, which is why I want to begin with a reflection on a figuration in my title that will lead us into the history of Jewish life in Germany after 1945 and German Jewish culture in contemporary Germany. The term in my title that I'm referring to is German Jewish. It is an established term in both German and Jewish studies. One speaks of German Jewish literature and culture in reference to a long tradition that reaches from the philosopher Moses Mendelssohn in the 18th century all the way to today. At first glance, the category might seem clear. It refers to the literature and culture of Jews in German-speaking lands. But a closer look results in many questions. Questions that touch on debates within the diverse Jewish communities that call contemporary Germany their home. The term German Jewish combines seemingly equally important aspects of the literature, culture, or people it describes. They're both German and Jewish. Yet although bridged by a hyphen, these two words have often represented opposites. So it is important to ask what each of them means and how their union in this term impacts one another. Their hyphenated existence exemplifies a larger concept that academic discourse has given a somewhat unfortunate botanical name, namely hybridity. German Jewish identity is an example of hybrid identity, yet whose identity does not consist of different aspects. All of us play various roles in our everyday lives. We might both be fathers and sons, both wives and bosses, both friends and critics. These aspects of our identity usually go together seamlessly for ourselves. We also choose identity designations. We might be lovers of classical music, as I know Tom is, or volunteer firefighters. I don't know if there are any in the room. We might be Democrats or Republicans. I see a couple showing color here in the first row. We might be a cat or a dog person. Anyone? Yeah. And we might be religious or atheist. We might be an avid hiker or a couch potato. All of these puzzle pieces make up who we are, and it is not usually highlighted as a hybrid identity. That's just who we are, right? This highlighting happens only to someone's self-understanding when the categories seem to exclude one another. This is particularly pronounced with categories into which we are born, such as being perhaps Mexican or American citizens, being black or white, being straight or gay. Some might, for instance, be surprised to hear that there are black Jews, while someone else might grapple with the idea of Buddhist Jews. Yet to the one living in both of these categories, this is still just who they are. Except, of course, that life at the borders of seemingly contradicting categories entails a lot of questions, and unfortunately, often also translates into mechanisms of exclusion. This is particularly true for those fixed categories into which we are born. Skin color and ethnicity, sexual orientation and gender, and nationality continue to be inflexible categories of inclusion and exclusion in our global society. We are experiencing this daily in debates ranging from the so-called refugee crisis to immigration, and from bathroom to pronoun usage. The label German Jewish is precisely one such contested combination of two aspects of an identity that has been perceived as a contradiction, especially since 1945, and it is therefore highlighted as hybrid. One might begin approaching this hybrid concept by asking which word to name first. Why is it not Jewish German, for instance? Already, we begin to see that the emphasis is not accidental, but that it communicates something to us that is equally apparent when we speak, for instance, of German Jews versus Jewish Germans. In the former, these Jews may consider themselves culturally German. In the latter, they may be understood as Germans of Jewish religion. There seems to be a more essential quality encompassed in the second word, whether it is a noun or not. And this corresponds with grammatical rules and is quite similar in the German equivalents of these terms. So rather than expressing multiplicity, then the term German Jewish seems to communicate a contradiction that is understood as neither fully this nor fully that. The hyphen between German and Jewish becomes a minus sign, a deduction, neither fully Jewish nor fully German. This interpretation is not just a matter of rhetoric. Unfortunately, belonging neither here nor there has been to varying degrees part of the German Jewish reality for centuries. Only in recent years has this narrative shifted to one of positive diversity. In this understanding, the term hybridity signals that German Jewish identity is more than just two parts. The parts come together to form something different and new. So if we look at this idea as a mathematical equation, the hyphen that represented a minus then becomes a plus. And this A plus B does not merely equal AB, but C. That is to say, German plus Jewish equals something more than just the sum of its parts. In Philip Roth's novel, The Counterlife from 1996, he describes the many aspects of identity in the following way. He says, the burden isn't either or. Consciously choosing from possibilities equally difficult and regrettable. It is and as well. Life is and. The accidental and the immutable, the elusive and the graspable, the bizarre and the predictable, the actual and the potential, all the multiplying realities, entangled, overlapping, colliding, conjoined, plus the multiplying illusions. This times this, times this, times this. Part of today's talk is working out what this and entails and how those two aspects productively interact with one another to give way to a particular quality that they would be lacking without one another. The sources I want to introduce to you in this exploration are all narrative texts. That is not only because I would categorize myself as both an avid reader and a literature professor, but also because narration is a cultural practice that is central to identity construction. When we encounter conflicts between different aspects of ourselves, now I lost my line here. When we encounter conflicts between different aspects of ourselves, we usually turn to language and we begin to explain. We begin to narrate how this came to be and how these different aspects of ourselves work together. So you might have stories that weave together threads of identity in your family, for instance, narratives that have been handed down through generations and serves to explain, quote unquote, who we are, we the Joneses. Storytelling is a productive reaction that creates something new. We make meaning in these moments. We braid together different aspects and therefore participate in the positive mathematical equation in which A plus B renders C. This C is a place of possibility. We find this space of possibility explored in storytelling and literature because narration is a space in which we can be anyone we want. In stories, we experience the freedom of becoming someone else, of making sense of who we are, of identifying with someone in a similar situation. We can escape the limitations of our own lives, discover new perspectives, and fill in the blanks. Stories can change the meaning of a string of facts and lay bare questions we didn't know we had. The ability of stories to make meaning works not just for individuals, but also larger groups, from families to nations. Stories, for instance, in our news coverage, are part of renegotiating how a nation understands itself and deals with its past, present, and future. We only have to open a paper these days, and we'll find plenty of examples of storytelling that partake in the process of making and shifting such national identity or other types of identity. Now, Heinrich Heine, probably one of the most famous representatives of German Jewish literature, described this very function of storytelling at the end of his life in 1829. He said, "Odd whim of the people. They demand their history from the hand of the poet and not the hand of the historian. They demand not the faithful report of naked facts, but those facts dissolved again into the primordial poetry from whence they originated. Not everything we read about human history sounds particularly poetic, to be frank, but looking at the other end of the spectrum, we will also never be able to find naked facts. We have long come to understand that history is written by the victors. That is, that the reporting of everyday facts already entails an act of interpretation as well as storytelling, which will organize, prioritize, and contextualize events in a certain manner. Hermann Blume, a scholar of cultural study, describes this powerful act as follows. He says, narration, as a basic form of cognitive processing, is a fundamental cultural technique. Not reality itself, but rather the narration of reality arranges events, actors, and actions over time. In using the ending as its starting point, narration points toward an outcome that fulfills the human need to create meaning. Communities of memory can form around certain narratives of reality. Collective identity is thus not based only on an quote-unquote imagined community, which is a term introduced by Benedict Anderson, but also on a narrated community. And whoever can dominate narration has the power to create a special version of reality, thereby engendering narration with a political dimension. So Blume points us to the importance of being aware of the power of storytelling and word choices in the world around us, which is one of the central lessons the humanities contribute to society. And it is precisely in literature that we can also find the antidote for the societal danger of quote-unquote being fed a narrative or controlling the narrative or having just one sanctioned narrative. Because literature is a space of alternative scenarios, of new perspectives and unheard voices. In literature, we can counter and encounter history from the perspective of those who did not win, those who are marginalized, silenced, and oppressed. So perhaps this is why German Jewish literature has always played such a central role in the German cultural production. The Enlightenment philosopher Moses Mendelssohn seemed to think that the ability to share stories, literature, culture, and philosophy in the same language would be the best way to achieve equal rights for the Jewish population of Germany at the end of the 18th century. He wanted to connect the two cultural spheres of German and Jewish life that had coexisted in a strictly hierarchical manner, and for this purpose, he encouraged the Jewish community to read and write in German instead of Yiddish. Mendelssohn's ideas reverberated well into the 20th century as the question of German Jewish identity continued to be discussed. Franz Rosenzweig, for instance, who is a German Jewish philosopher of that time, described the effect of Mendelssohn's revolutionary idea in 1920 as follows. How should they, and here it gets complicated, how should they, that is the people around Mendelssohn, comprehend that here, that is in Mendelssohn's person, here in front of them, stood not one human being, but two? Rosenzweig returns us once more to this idea of hybridity, in which one person can have multiple or overlapping aspects of their identity. But he also draws attention to something other than the two spheres of German and Jewish life that Mendelssohn straddled so successfully. Rosenzweig's formulation emphasizes a commonality that does not quite translate idiomatically into English, which is why I'm giving you the German and will explain in a second. So what he does is he emphasizes the word Mensch, and you might know this word from Yiddish. In German, it means human being, which would in English be simply rendered as person, in this quote, for instance. And Mensch is used in English context, sort of with the Yiddish understanding. He's such a Mensch, for instance, right? So such a good person. But in German, it's not an indication of a person's character. It's simply the neutral term for a human being. Now, why all these translation acrobatics, you might ask? Rosenzweig's formulation emphasizes that Mendelssohn appeared as more than just one human being. His hybrid identity makes the humanity of both of his aspects visible. Others begin seeing a human being where before they saw either a Jew or a German, negotiated through this label. Emphasizing the commonality of Germans and Jews as human beings was Mendelssohn's achievement in the context of 18th century humanism, among many other things, I should say. He fought for equal human rights with the weapon of a shared language and shared storytelling. And Mendelssohn's choice of the German language founded a rich tradition of German Jewish literature without which contemporary culture is unthinkable. The list of authors is long, and it includes many very famous names, as you can see, for instance, in this big German Encyclopedia of German Jewish Literature, which was first published in the year 2000. It's a really, really big book. I should have actually brought it to make my point. Yet, there is a caesura in this tradition. After the book burnings of the Nazis, many believed that this tradition, this rich tradition of German Jewish literature, had come to an end. Both within and outside of the Jewish community, voices thought that this was the case. Yet, the decimation of this flourishing community and the fundamental break within this long tradition generated a new necessity for literature as a means of coping with the loss. The horrors of the Holocaust needed new forms of expression to work through history and negotiate forms of memorialization, which has posed a particular challenge to German Jewish authors to this day, no matter where they position themselves within German or Jewish literature. The diversity that has developed within German Jewish literature since 1945 shows the perseverance and success of this grappling with the German Jewish past, present, and future. The authors themselves engage actively with the idea of quote-unquote German Jewish literature, as well as culture and identity, in many, many creative ways. And you'll hear about some of these creative ways today. So, as we have seen, the term German Jewish is a complicated label, and it becomes ever more complex when we look at the individual authors usually included in this tradition. Let's take, for instance, world-famous Franz Kafka, right from the cover of the Encyclopedia. He lived in Prague, he wrote in German, and his manuscripts were posthumously taken to Mandite Palestine by his friend Max Brod. There are plenty of parties who could and would like to claim Kafka and his brilliance as part of their cultural heritage. And in this case, the question actually went to court. Between 2007 and 2012, a trial sought to determine where the contents of a suitcase of Kafka's manuscripts should find a home. Should they be housed in a German literature archive or in the Israeli National Library? It was a complicated situation for a variety of reasons, which you can read more about in the New York Times article from 2010 called Kafka's Last Trials. Trial, no plural, hopefully. And the papers are now in Israel, so I'm just giving you here the result. But what's interesting is the debate surrounding this case, because it made clear how fraught the term German Jewish literature really is, and how difficult it is to determine belonging. Looking through some entries in this encyclopedia I just showed you, many more such cases underscore how difficult and sometimes deeply problematic it can be to assign this label of German Jewishness. The author Jurek Becker, for instance, who wrote the popular novel Jacob the Liar, which you might know in a film version with Robin Williams, which is sort of, well, read the book. I can just say read the book. This author, Jurek Becker, he was born to Jewish parents, and he survived the Lodz ghetto as well as the Ravensbrück and Sachsenhausen concentration camps as a young child. His novels are written in German, and his main characters in these novels are Jewish. Yet in an essay from 1977, he says that he does not consider himself Jewish. And he emphasizes, like Rosenzweig, the shared notion of being a human being, ein Mensch. He says, "To this day, I do not know which attributes make a human being Jewish. I know that others think they know such attributes. I hear that a Jew is someone with a Jewish mother. Those who believe that may stick with it, but I cannot be part of that. A human being is someone with human beings for parents, not more and not less." In this deeply personal take, which, I can also see many might find problematic, Becker ultimately also settles on the shared humanity. That's sort of the common ground that he settles on, that supersedes any other categories of belonging, inclusion, and exclusion. Applying the attribute Jewish to literature instead of a person results in many similar questions about the qualities that include or exclude a text in this category. Does the author have to self-identify as Jewish? Jurek Becker does not, as we've seen, despite having a Jewish mother, experiencing Nazi persecution, and focusing on Jewish protagonists and themes in his works. Yet he appears in the Encyclopedia. Others have decided for him on the basis of seemingly clear evidence. His statement also raises the question whether to count only authors who are of matrilineal Jewish descent, so have a Jewish mother. If so, patrilineal Jewish authors, like for instance Friedrich Jelinek, the Austrian Nobel Prize winner, would have to be struck from the canon. And what about converts, such as Benjamin Stein? Would their pre-conversion writing be included? Does the author even have to be religious or be steeped in a particular cultural tradition or knowledge? So perhaps you might say the author is not the deciding factor, but the text. After all, she said, read the book, right? So does it have to be Jewish topics or characters? In this case, we face another problem because popular authors like W.G. Sebald or Kevin Veneman, who write predominantly and very successfully about Jewish figures without being Jewish, would be included. Yet, the argument is raised, can they even write authentically about Jewish experience? Does that require a certain experiences, or, as some others have argued, a certain style? Maybe writing that is reminiscent of Sholem Aleichem and Isaac Bashevis Singer. And then, can such a text even be written in German if it's about the style? Should it be? So none of these qualities, from fatherland to mother tongue, from text to context, seem to solve the problem of defining German Jewish literature without raising a host of new questions and issues. And nonetheless, for a lack of better words, we, and I here in particular, keep speaking about German Jewish literature in reference to a specific corpus of text that includes everyone I just mentioned. As a literature professor, I caution my students of one problem in literary analysis that seems to be of particular significance here. The blurring of author and narrator, of autobiographical background with text, leads to assumptions that can preclude other interpretations, and yet we seem to have particular trouble separating text and identity when it comes to reading German Jewish literature. Now, we're switching to making a bit of a shift to the contemporary situation. So contemporary German Jewish writing plays very consciously with the complexity of identity and its nuances, and some of these books purposefully blur the boundaries of author and text. Heir to both a long literary tradition, as you've just seen, and also a particular burden, these authors, many of whom also lead a life as public intellectuals in the German media, address German Jewish identity, culture, and life explicitly. Contemporary Jews living in Germany who don't engage with this topic professionally can also not help but be acutely aware of the complex questions that surround their identity and its historical significance. The legacy of the Holocaust has been part and parcel of the German public discourse for several decades now, and growing up in Germany, I, like every other school child, traveled to the sites of former concentration camps, met with survivors, and spent what I estimate to be about 80% of the allotted time for history classes on the time period between 1933 and 1945. As a teenager, my peers and I learned significantly more about the impact of the Weimar Republic than that of Weimar classicism, which is to say that we knew more about Hitler's rise than that of Goethe and Schiller. We knew the words of the no longer used national anthem, but we did not know the words of the current German anthem, and I can say, collectively, only learned it when the Soccer World Cup was taking place in Germany in 2006. Before that, there had been no single opportunity to sing the national anthem in my personal experience, and any German flag I had seen would have either flown in front of an official government building or else been met with a series of very critical questions to the owner. The Germany of the 1990s and 2000s was, and in many ways still is, a place in which expressions of national pride result in having to step down from political office. German identity emerged as an utterly unclear concept from 40 years of East-West separation, and both Germanys had developed their identities in large parts as a counterfoil to their fascist past. This left the still quite recently reunited country with an identity ex negativo. That is, the only thing that was clear all along was what Germany should never again become. In order to understand this contemporary situation and its impact on German Jewish identity, I'm now taking you on a very brief historical overview of Jewish life in Germany after the war. After 1945, Germany's reorganization and denazification efforts were initially determined by the Allies, and many of the Jewish people from all over Europe who found themselves in German displaced person camps understandably left as soon as they could, particularly after the founding of the state in Israel in 1948. Only a very small number of Jewish people, estimated as low as 10,000, decided to stay and either settle in Germany for the first time or return to their German hometowns from displacement or exile. In some cases, staying was not so much a decision as a temporary inability to move or return elsewhere that turned a provisional state situation into permanence. In other cases, return from exile occurred only after a number of years, and a popular expression of the time describes Jews in Germany as sitting on packed suitcases, ready to leave again at the smallest sign of danger. All in all, virtually everyone at the time assumed that the remaining group would eventually leave too, and Germany would never see a thriving Jewish community again. This, in fact, nearly happened to the Jewish community in East Germany, which continued to be threatened under communism. By the time the wall was built in 1961, it had only 1,500 members who self-identified officially as Jewish, a number which had shrunk to approximately 400 by the time the wall fell in 1989. In West Germany, numbers dwindled as well, and after the birth of two post-war generations, it is usually estimated that there were no more than 30,000 people identifying as Jewish in Germany in 1990. These numbers, both in the East and West, rely on official religious affiliations that Germany registers for tax purposes. And that in itself is a complicated topic for another time. But its effect for Jewish citizens of Germany is that it only counts those who choose to self-identify through membership in a synagogue. So the numbers therefore surely omit a sizable group of people, since many Jews in both East and West Germany were hesitant to publicly identify themselves for a variety of very understandable reasons, and yet many others did not consider themselves religious and therefore do not show up in this count. In the first two post-war decades, German society grappled with the aftermath of the war in many ways, but not by addressing their own crimes from within. Efforts were focused on rebuilding, on getting used to the two new political systems in the East and West with a scarcity of untainted candidates for office, and on gaining more or less successfully economic and political independence from the US and the Soviet Union, respectively. Denazification and the big war crime trials, such as in Nuremberg, broadcast the horrors of the Holocaust in minute detail, but it was only when the war generation's children entered adolescence that a demand for public engagement with the German crimes began to ring out from within. Around the world, students demonstrated against the Vietnam War and the 1968 student protests, but in West Germany, one of their major demands entailed removing anyone with a Nazi past from positions of influence, also reforming the education system to include a thorough engagement with Germany's culpability, and engaging in a public conversation that would collectively and individually, quote-unquote, deal with the past. This term, in German Vergangenheitsbewältigung, was eventually replaced by the notion of an ongoing working through the past, based on the understanding that the past could never be conclusively dealt with. While Germans of the Nazi generation had largely kept silent until forced to acknowledge their involvement by their children, many Jewish authors were already addressing their experiences in various forms during those 2 decades. This set of German Jewish writers is often divided into 2 generations. The first generation of German Jewish writers shared their first-hand experiences of the Holocaust, and their works became of central significance in the 1970s and 1980s, when, as I mentioned, the West German media and education system became invested in serious public discourse about the Holocaust. At the same time, the so-called second generation of German Jewish writers, often the children of survivors, were coming of age and becoming prominent voices in this public discourse. The extensive discourse about Vergangenheitsbewältigung, particularly since the 1980s, led to what many have called an atmosphere of philo-Semitism. That is the opposite of anti-Semitism, in which everything Jewish becomes beloved. But in the German context, this term implies that everything Jewish became sacred and untouchable. And the problem with this stance is that it doesn't allow for genuine Jewish life and culture to thrive, because it elevates Jewish culture to the status of a work of art that should be looked at, but not touched or engaged with. And philo-Semitism in the German context was accused of understanding Jewish life only through the legacy of collective victimhood, sort of preserving everyone in sort of this understanding. A recent book that made waves about this topic, if you're interested, that made waves in the US, that is to say, is Yascha Monk's Stranger in My Own Country, peer-reviewed in the New York Times. So in rather broad strokes, we have now arrived in 1990 and are nearing our sense of what is contemporary, I would say. After the end of the Cold War, the German landscapes changed drastically in more than one way, and its after effects fundamentally changed Jewish life in Germany today. The fall of the Iron Curtain and new political regulations led to an influx of approximately 220,000 Jews from the former Soviet Union to Germany between the years 1991 and 2004. Of these, fewer than half became involved in Jewish religious life, yet you will nonetheless find that many of the Jewish communities in Germany today are Russian-spoken. Recently, another group of immigrants has begun to impact discussions about German Jewry. A number of young Israelis have made Germany, and particularly Berlin, their home, peaking in the year 2012 with more than 2,500 new arrivals. Two reasons they name for their move are the lower cost of living and Berlin's perceived cosmopolitanism. For similar reasons, a small number of Americans has joined them as well. In 2015, Jews officially affiliated with one of the religious communities in Germany numbered a little over 100,000, while the total estimate of Jewish people in Germany was around 250,000. Of course, in an American context, and compared to the pre-war period, these numbers are very, very low. They are also low in a German context. Keep in mind that Germany has about 80 million people and accepted roughly 1.1 million refugees from Syria and other non-European countries in 2015 alone. Yet the small size of the German Jewish communities is precisely why their diversity and impact are so remarkable. And I'm using the plural now and say communities because Jewish life in Germany takes many diverse forms. Since the mid-19th century, Jewish congregations in Germany have followed the concept, and here's another German word for you, of the so-called Einheitsgemeinde, which literally means unified community. This was an initially involuntary reduction to one official Jewish religious community per city that was kept in place voluntarily. Such a community would combine all strands of Judaism under one roof, though the majority within those communities was usually part of Reform Judaism until the Holocaust. After 1945, the remaining unified communities in Germany became predominantly modern Orthodox, and they experienced a never-before-seen multiplication of members with the influx of Jews from the former Soviet Union. Yet religious pluralism is developing rapidly, and Berlin currently has its first female conservative or Masorti rabbi, and one can now become ordained at several schools in Germany. This pluralism is in some ways the result of the generational and linguistic gaps that have led to conflicts between and within traditional communities and new developments in recent years. The descendants from Jewish displaced persons or exiles who remained or returned to Germany after 1945, for instance, often come from intermarried families or have patrilineal Jewish heritage, since the German Jewish community had been so small between 1945 and 1990. Because of their non-Jewish spouses or mothers, many German Jews experienced exclusion from the largely modern Orthodox unified communities of the 1990s, which included almost all clubs, daycares, schuls, and other organizations of Jewish community life, and which also received the majority of all designated state funding. A few years ago, I was invited to speak at a conference for and about patrilineal Jews in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, and the feeling of exclusion by their own community was overwhelmingly palpable among the German attendees, underscoring their unique situation. It was very different with the Austrian and Swiss visitors. So this small group of children and grandchildren of survivors who continued their lives in Germany has experienced a series of exclusions. Declared not German by the Nazis, questions for their decision to stay in Germany after the Holocaust by everyone around the world, bearing the burden of representing the victims in Germany for decades, and suddenly losing access to German Jewish communities for not being Jewish enough. The members of this group I encountered felt strongly about both their Germanness and their Jewishness. And as a result, now many new communities have sprung up across Germany in recent years, which take inspiration from various American and Israeli models of modern Jewish culture. There are many Jewish schools in Germany now, ranging from kindergarten, or I should say again, ranging from kindergarten to K-12 and from schuls to public venues. There are several Jewish newspapers and other media, including a long list of periodicals and events just such as the Eurovision Song Contest, which is inspired by the Eurovision Song Contest, which places contemporary German Jewish culture in the heart of Europe. You can look up most of these on the website of the Zentralrat der Juden in Deutschland, which is the Central Council of Jews in Germany, which organizes many aspects of Jewish life in Germany. And you can also find many of the clubs, communities, research institutes, journals, newspapers, and so forth online if you're interested. And some of them have English versions, so you can read about how what is important to Jews living in Germany on any given day in those newspapers. So in the final minutes I have left, I would like to return to contemporary German Jewish literature because it grapples so explicitly with these ideas and challenges I presented, and because literary figures can play with identity categories and their boundaries with seemingly greater ease than we do. At the same time, I see this as a very enjoyable opportunity to recommend literature to you. You've seen that secret agenda probably throughout. Read more. Just told my students in the class earlier, so a few of them I think are sitting here. They're hearing that again. And I want to give you also a glimpse at German Jewish identities in the 21st century through this literature. Given their recent publication date, some of these texts have not yet been translated into English, but that might present an interesting opportunity to our graduate students on the translation track. I will do my best to excite your interest, but not give away too much. So there is, for instance, Benjamin Stein's 2010 novel, The Canvas, which approaches the idea of hybridity very pragmatically through its form. You can start reading it from either side, as you see here on the slide, from the left and from the right, which evokes both a layout of German and Hebrew texts. Stein not really, of course, you have to flip it over, but there's the idea. Stein invites you to begin where you'd like and switch between stories wherever you want. His two Jewish protagonists are connected through a third, one who actively constructs and deconstructs ideas about identity. I don't want to give away too much, so I'll give you another one. Identity construction is also at the center of Zafa Senochak's novel Dangerous Kinship, which usually appears in a quite different kind of hybrid canon. Senochak is a successful author in the field described as German-Turkish literature, and our department was lucky enough to have had him as writer in residence only fairly recently. Though this novel, in particular, is from 1998, many parts of its storyline couldn't be more pertinent today. The protagonist has German Jewish as well as Turkish grandparents, and thus fits perfectly into the new transcultural German landscape. He discusses topics of shared Turkish-Jewish interest, ranging from circumcision to assimilation into Germany, and also to genocide. The protagonist's Turkish grandfather becomes an unwilling assistant in the Armenian genocide, while his Jewish grandparents flee from Germany to Turkey shortly before the Second World War in order to escape precisely this kind of persecution. So therefore the protagonist calls himself a grandchild of victims and perpetrators and raises entirely new questions in modern Germany, whose largest minority population is of Turkish descent. In the novel, it says about the protagonist's Turkish grandfather who experienced the First World War on the side of the Ottoman Empire. He speaks Armenian and Russian perfectly and is light-skinned. You are like 3 men. The commander sends him out to scout, and that is the voice of the commander speaking. This perfect spy's triple identity recalls Rosenzweig's description of Moses Mendelssohn as 2 beings in one, if you remember, 2 human beings in one. The protagonist straddles being more than one in a literal borderland where his ambiguous identity allows him to pass in various ways. Yet the novel also describes the other side of hybridity, in which it leads to exclusion instead of inclusion, when it says, "You do not get to choose who or what you are. That is decided by the others, those who do not consider you one of them. Everyone who has once tried switching sides in life makes this experience." I want to end with an example that is perhaps the most explicit engagement with contemporary and future German Jewish identities to date. In Lena Gorelik's 2011 novel, Dear Mischa, she addresses her newborn son, who, according to the subtitle you see here, would have nearly been called Shlomo Adolf Greenblum. With a lot of humor and sarcasm, she explains to him what it means to be Jewish in Germany today. With equal parts provocation and humor, she quips about the internal struggles regarding this question in contemporary German Jewish communities when she says, and she's always speaking to her son, "The other day, your uncle said during one of our cozy family evenings, which are much more cozy in the imagination than in reality, that in Judaism, it is much like in the food industry. Both fight about whether a slice of cold cuts, which is made from meat leftovers, can officially be called ham." In a community with vastly distinct experiences, where the descendants of displaced persons in Germany meet Russian-spoken Jews who lost their religious and cultural heritage under communism, questions of Jewish identity and authenticity have repeatedly become the subject of internal debate. In addition, there's a larger community of Germany and of the world in which the author Gorelik situates her experience. Paraphrasing Goethe's novel Faust, she says, "2 hearts are beating in my chest. My enlightened cosmopolitan heart is the loud one. Thump, thump, thump. It goes in regular beats." See, this wasn't regular. Loud, confident, clear. The other is the Jewish heart. It is quieter, more irregular. It goes but, and sometimes oive. Yet in this struggle of seemingly competing identity concepts, too, the focus on shared humanity is what remains, and Lena Gorelik concludes by sending her son out into the world with the following words: "Go out and be a proud Jew, my Mischa, or rather, go out and be a good human being. But for that, you don't have to be a Jew. However, you are a Jew, whether you want it or not." What life will be like for the 4th generation of German Jews or Jewish Germans has yet to be found out, and I'm curious to see where it goes. Thank you.